The federal government does not like talking about this subject, so we're going to. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. Today we're going to be talking about something that has been a topic of our interest for a long while, but it's been difficult to address properly. And we wanted to make sure that when we did so, we had the proper information, the proper platform, and a good format for the video, so that it's not gonna slip through the cracks and you'll really understand the gravity of what we're discussing here. And when you look into the comments, or sorry, not the comments, into the description of this video, might also pin a comment, but if you look at the description of this video, what you're going to see is a list of charities and social organizations dedicated to what has become known as the missing and murdered Indigenous women phenomenon. Now, you may be familiar with this phenomenon if you've been following our channel. We've mentioned it on a few occasions. The general idea here is that there is an epidemic of violence against Indigenous women in the United States and Canada. Now, the US and Canada typically use different terms for Native Americans. We often call them Native Americans, while the Canadians use the term First Nations. In both cases, the MMIW phenomenon applies. The Canadians are dealing with it, as are the Americans, and in different ways to different levels of effectiveness. We'll explain exactly why it is that this problem is so different from the typical missing persons problem, but we've got to start with the basics here, with the beginning, and part of that is acknowledging the fact that there's a bit of an ugly past between the United States federal government and the Native American peoples of this continent. While you don't hear a ton about it in primary and secondary school, there has been a pattern of revoked promises, forced migrations, and brutal war tactics against Native American tribes and nations by the US military, government, and even just civilians going out to settle. Now, I'm not gonna, paint this as being a simple issue of black and white where the Americans were the bad guys and the natives were the perfect good guys. There were atrocities committed by both sides, going back to basically when this country was settled. It has been a bloodbath, and of course the United States, as the invading and conquering nation, does bear a lot of the blame. But the real issue is not that the two groups fought as brutally as they did. That's to be expected with warfare. It's the way that the government has treated the Native Americans in defeat that is truly just sad. For example, in the 1800s, you may be aware of the Trail of Tears, more formally known the Indian Removal Act. Presented by Andrew Jackson as a way to prevent the annihilation of the Native Americans of the southern United States, what it was in reality, though presented as a land exchange, it was a forced migration. They took people from the 5 civilized tribes, as they referred to it, those tribes, of course, being the Cherokee, Seminoles, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Chickasaw nations. It also, to a lesser extent, affected the Wyandot, Potawatomi, Shawnee, and Lenape peoples. And of course, while Andrew Jackson, then President of the United States, supported this Indian Removal Act, famous frontiersman Davy Crockett, then a Tennessee congressman, opposed it. So it's important to note here that this was not in any way something that was not controversial, even at the time. Fact of the matter is, Americans at the time knew that this was wrong, but they were in many ways powerless to stop a federal government hell-bent on expanding the borders of the country. And the natives had different responses. The Cherokee decided to fight it in court, and they lost, and the Seminoles decided to actually fight it. They started a war which they arguably never gave up. They never surrendered. A century later, the federal government would try to revoke the protections given to the Klamath tribes, and this is important because the government had granted them their rights and lands in perpetuity. That was the legal terminology. But the Klamath Termination Act, which passed in the 1950s, got rid of those rights. They eventually were restored in 1986 under Reagan, but they spent approximately 30 years without any of their promised tribal rights. Now today, the tensions have cooled considerably. There have not been nearly the level of antagonism by the United States against Native tribes. That said, Native communities typically are underserved by the US federal government. A lot of people will make the argument that because they have autonomy and are not technically bound by the same rights, rules, and regulations as American citizens that are not on reservations, it's kind of been a cop-out by the government. We took a lot from these people and have not appropriately given back. Of course, it would be impossible to give back their original homelands without displacing millions and millions of people who themselves did nothing wrong, but we could do a lot more. Some ways in which this manifests itself, this lack of attention and lack of care, are in the rates of violence against Native peoples. Now, Native American women are far more likely than Anglo-Saxon or just in general non-Hispanic white women to experience violence. According to the National Institute of Justice, compared to white women, Native Americans are 20% more likely to experience violence, and of Native American victims who reported the violence against them, 97% experienced violence by non-natives. Now, 35% also experienced violence within the Native community, but I think it's very important to recognize that only 3% of Native American victims were able to say it was not a non-native. Now, statistics don't differentiate between races of perpetrators, they just classify it as native or non-native. Of victims, 41% of women claim that they were physically injured, and about half required medical services. But I've really put a target on the government's back here, and I think you'll understand why with this specific number. In 2016, there were 5,712 reports of missing Native American women. Only 116 were recorded by the government. 5,712 reported cases, 116 recorded by the government. Following 2016, things have gotten better. A lot more attention has been paid to Native American troubles, and some of the issues that were causing this have been remedied. For example, until 2013, Native police could not prosecute non-natives. They could only prosecute on reservation, so if you went on the reservation, committed a crime, and then left, they had no jurisdiction to go after you. You might ask, well, what about the police off reservation? Could they not go get the person and extradite? No. Legally, until 2022, this actually was a decision made in June of this past year, state police could not prosecute for crimes on native land. It was just red tape. Now, it kind of makes sense, because the two want to be independent. The natives don't want American police overseeing native affairs, and American police generally don't have the resources to go and oversee native affairs. Because there's so much autonomy and a strict legal distinction between a Native American reservation and state land, there was no effective way for these two groups to communicate. The FBI was basically the only law enforcement agency able to intervene, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but not in an efficient way. So, for decades and decades, this has prevented Native Americans from seeking justice against non-native perpetrators because most of them don't live on the reservations. Of course, now natives and state police can actually work together. Tribal police and state police can pursue these crimes in unison, in conjunction, and they are much more likely now to actually prosecute somebody. Still not great numbers, but it's better than it was before 2013. The federal government has also taken an interest and begun to pay more attention. In 2019, the Trump administration created the Presidential Task Force on Missing and Murdered American Indians and Alaskan Natives. Now, of course, the term American Indian is controversial, but it is usually the legal terminology. And perhaps more importantly, social media influencers in this space that we occupy have begun to draw more and more attention to what is a legitimate problem. A lot of people will look at it and say, this is not that many people. 5,712? 500,000 people go missing every year. They're more often found because the resources are there and the jurisdictions make sense, and we actually record them. Again, 5,712 cases, the government only recorded 116. One of the most important awareness efforts, however, was an actual Hollywood production, the movie Wind River, which came out in 2017 and starred Jeremy Renner and Elizabeth Olsen. Before we get into this second portion of the video, I want to make it clear that we will be discussing plot points from the movie Wind River as a way to discuss actual things that happen, problems with jurisdiction, the rate of violence, things like that. There will be spoilers, this will be distressing. If this is not the kind of thing you're cut out for, then this is the time to stop watching the video. You've gotten the relevant information. We're now going to put it into narrative form. The movie follows Jeremy Renner's character, Corey Lambert, and Elizabeth Olsen's character, Jane Banner. Jeremy Renner is playing a fish and wildlife officer. Elizabeth Olsen is playing an FBI agent, as they seek to solve the murder, as they determine it, of Natalie Hansen. Natalie is an 18-year-old Arapaho woman who lives with her family on the Wind River Reservation in central Wyoming. The Wind River Reservation is shared by the Eastern Shoshone and the Northern Arapaho peoples. It measures 60 miles by 50 miles, or 3,000 square miles, which makes it bigger than 32 countries. It has a population of 27,088 people, or about 7.7 per square mile, which is not dense. It is, however, the 7th largest reservation in the United States of America. Interestingly enough, however, due to land agreements that they have made with, the state of Wyoming, more than half of the people who live within the Wind River Reservation's boundaries are non-natives, about 15,000 of that 27,000. And those non-natives are primarily located in the city of Riverton, which is 89.6% non-native. The movie starts off by showing you Corey Lambert, the agent played by Jeremy Renner. And he is an experienced marksman, tracker, fish and wildlife officer. His job is basically hunting. So he takes out some coyotes, and then he gets called up by a local farmer who's had a few of his cattle killed by mountain lions. So Agent Lambert goes and starts looking for these mountain lions and finds something else, the body of Natalie Hansen. When he finds her, it appears that she has frozen to death. She is lying face down in the snow with blood coming out of her mouth. Her hair is covered in frost. It's a pretty grisly scene. So, of course, he heads back and speaks to tribal police, and this is where the jurisdictional issues begin to arise. They get Banner, the agent from the FBI. She is woefully underprepared for the weather and reveals that she's actually flown in from Las Vegas because they have no stations closer than Vegas. In case you're wondering how far Vegas and Wyoming are, very far. In fact, there should be a map right here that shows Vegas to Wyoming. One aspect of the movie that I think really drives the point home is the way in which they use dialogue. It's not on the nose. It's not simple question, answer. We need to know the statistics. Well, here's the statistics. It's not like that. They managed to make you understand things like crime rate and jurisdiction issues based on things people say as offhanded comments. For example, Banner asks, "How experienced is your medical examiner?" And the chief says, "Let's just say he stays busy," which means there's a high rate of crime. Hits a lot harder than just saying there's a high rate of crime. She then asks Agent Lambert, "How well do you know this land?" And he replies, "Like it's my job." So as you can see, they've done a good job humanizing these characters, making them feel real, and I think that that's extremely important to spreading this message, is that it's not just some story, it's not a narrative. This is a thing that happens, and these people experience it in their day-to-day lives. To them, it's not anything particularly unusual, it's just a sad reality. Throughout the movie, you get references to things like the natives saying they're not used to an FBI agent caring. They're not used to passion from law enforcement. They're used to basically being told this is their business, their problem. And they also have some commentary on the effectiveness of FBI agents. Lambert's tracking abilities as a fish and wildlife officer far outclass Banner's ability to assess the scene of the crime. He can tell stuff by looking at her footprints that Banner can't tell from looking at her body. Another subtle bit of commentary here is that it's mentioned early in the movie that the closest, as they're examining the crime scene, that the closest structure to where the body was found is an oil rig. But that's not their immediate thought process. They say, oh, well, the oil rig, it's closed down in the winter, whatever, not a big deal. Let's focus on native suspects, or at the very least, community suspects. And they continue with these small dialogue cues, because Lambert's son, who appears to be about 10 years old, asks his father what happened to her, knowing that a girl was found, but not totally necessarily knowing the situation. So the kid asks what happened, and then asks, was it like Emily? Emily being his older sister, and Jeremy Renner's character says she froze to death. His son says, so like Emily. His son knows Emily didn't freeze to death, which means that even the kids know that this is a problem. It's something that they experience. It is so well known to be a problem within the Native communities because the child is half Native American. It's so well known within their communities that even the little kids know. Next, Agent Banner has the body sent to the medical examiner. The medical examiner performs an autopsy and comes to the conclusion that Natalie was sexually assaulted numerous times before dying. However, the cause of death is a pulmonary embolism because she was out running in sub-zero temperatures to get away. Her lungs, the fluid began to crystallize, which caused the actual blood vessels in her lungs to burst, causing her to drown in her own blood. And this is probably the most direct that the movie is about jurisdictional issues, because the medical examiner can't list it as a homicide because while it's pretty clear that there was foul play, there's no physical injury that would have caused death that was caused by another person. She does have a laceration on her forehead, but not deep enough to kill her. So the most that they can call this is sexual assault, for lack of a YouTube-friendly term. At the same time, Agent Banner can't call in an FBI team because this is not considered a homicide. The only people who can consider this a homicide and call in a team for it, based on the evidence available, are the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who operate differently and outside the jurisdiction of anyone involved in the room. In my opinion, what this scene is serving, the purpose of this scene is to show that many of these cases can be solved. It's the jurisdictional issues and the red tape that the government puts onto these investigations that makes them unsolvable. Like I said, 5,712 cases. The government recorded 116. So, understaffed tribal police, this community has only 6 police officers. The bureaucracy of the federal government, and just in general the apathy of the powers involved, all play roles in this crisis. And then the movie plays on some of the trust issues between whites and Native Americans. Now, Elizabeth Olsen's character is very earnestly trying to help, trying to solve this case. She wants justice. She doesn't quite know how to communicate that. And naturally, the natives are distrustful of some federal employee coming out onto their land and trying to solve their crimes. They want the crime solved, but they don't believe that that's truly the FBI's motivation. Natalie's father, for example, speaking to Agent Banner, says, "Why is it whenever you people try to help, it starts with insults?" So it's made very clear that this age-old distrust between white Americans and Native Americans is playing a role in solving some of these cases. How can the natives trust the white man to come in and help them after all the times that we promised to do so and then turned our backs on them? Even if you disagree with that assessment of history, that's the way they perceive it, and that plays a role. But the writers made very sure to include another point, because while Agent Banner can't get through to them, Agent Lambert can. Natalie's father is somebody he knows personally, and they share a moment where they basically both break down and understand, and Natalie's father, Mr. Hansen, he doesn't have any animosity towards Mr. Lambert. He knows he can trust him. So there's an important note here as well about the fact that the trust between Native Americans and European Americans can be rebuilt if we actually work together. The movie also addresses poverty within Native American communities because there is a lot of drug use and alcoholism due to the lack of opportunities due to, the history. And because of this impoverished situation, all of this drug use, Agent Banner ends up being forced to shoot a Native American man who fired a shotgun at her because he was on drugs and they were trying to arrest him. It's important to note that it was not just Agent Banner trying to arrest him, it was also the tribal police, so this is not, I know that it could sound like white woman shoots Native man. There's more nuance to it. I highly recommend you watch the movie. But that Native man who she was forced to shoot has 2 friends who try to escape, and Agent Lambert takes them out with a blue snow shovel. I'm not kidding. That's actually what he does. One of those friends reveals that Natalie was dating a white man, which changes the paradigm here. They were looking for a native man. Now, it might get more complicated. At first glance, it might seem like, oh, that really narrows it down, but it's not that simple, because whites typically don't live in parts of the reservation that are under the jurisdiction of Native police, or, in certain cases, even sheriff's deputies. And that's important because the guy in question works on the security detail at the oil rig that is there year-round. Suddenly, that oil rig's location in regards to Natalie's body makes a lot more sense, but they find all of this out after the discovery of another body, a white man's body, which has been stripped naked and thrown off a snowmobile into the mountains. That body belonged to Natalie's boyfriend. The plot thickens considerably. After learning this information, we learn that Lambert lost his daughter in pretty much the same way that Mr. Hansen lost his daughter, and that Natalie and Agent Lambert's daughter, Emily, were best friends. So, Agent Lambert has a hunch, and the tribal chief has a hunch, and the sheriff has a hunch, and Agent Olsen has a hunch that the oil rig security detail might have something to do with this, considering the dead oil security detail guy they found in the mountains, half eaten by an eagle. So they show up. They pull up on snowmobiles, riding 6 or 7 deep, and they start to discuss with the security detail. Now, from this point on, I'm not going to spoil the climax of the movie. It's, I think, pretty clear what happens from here, though. I'll give you this much. Law enforcement ends up in an armed standoff with the security detail. There's no shooting immediately, but watch the movie. It's such a good movie. Like, even outside of the issue at hand, it's a really well-written film. It could have been completely and totally fictional and still would have been a great movie. And it is a fictional movie. Now, the Wind River situation did not actually happen. This is not a true story. This is not based on true events. What it is, something of an artist's representation. The people who wrote the movie did so for the same reason that the guys who just made Devotion did it. Because it was something they were passionate about. An issue that they genuinely believed should be better recognized. I'm harping on saying watch the movie, and it's on Amazon Prime. I'll put a link in the description. I harp on saying watch the movie because it portrays all of this in a far more visceral sense than my words ever could. The goal of both this video and that movie is to present you with an understanding of what a lot of people are going through. It may seem like the kind of thing that you couldn't do anything about yourself, but the reality is, especially if you're over the age of 18, but of course if you're under the age of 18, you can always write. But over the age of 18, you can vote for politicians who want to do something about this. You can vote for people who are going to hold people's feet to the fire until this is solved or until it at least gets better. Like I said, there's been strides made, but we have a long way to go before we solve this. So, next election cycle, write your representatives, write your senator. Go to a town hall, ask a question about if this is something that they would be willing to vote for funding towards or to write legislation about. Even if you live, on the eastern seaboard and there aren't Native American reservations, it's still an important issue, and just because it doesn't directly affect us doesn't mean that we can't try and do something about it to help save lives. And if you're on the eastern seaboard, you also don't totally have an excuse to not care, because one of the tribes affected by this was the Lenape, and they're from Delaware. So, if you're so inclined, please write a representative, make a Facebook post, share it on Twitter, share this video because it would spread the word, and check out the organizations and social groups listed in the description below. And if you want to support what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, you can subscribe to our Patreon for just $1 a month, or you can check out our various sponsorships through the aidenmattis.card.co link in the description. And we also, of course, have our coffee, which is Mount Pocono Perk, from Tableau Roasting Company, a small artisan roasting company down in Kentucky. If that interests you, if you like coffee, I promise you will not regret it. So, with all of that said, I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.